So I shaped the C-bouts, I shaped the upper and the lower blocks, and the most important thing of all is that I got my hair cut, probably the best decision that I've made this summer. So now the thing that I will have to do next is to bend the C-bout ribs. Before that, I am going to be choosing the ribs in the right direction of the grain and the flame, so that's going to take a little bit of time, which probably I'm not going to be filming because it's just going to be me looking at them in very different angles, and it's not extremely fun to watch. I actually enjoy doing it, but yeah, just to look at me doing that, it's not really very interesting. It's very repetitive, monotone and boring, I guess. So I'm going to be doing that. Then I'm also going to be cutting the ribs at a length and a height slightly longer than the finished one. I want it to be slightly longer because that makes it easier to bend. It gives me a little bit of margin. But if they are too long, it actually it's a bit annoying. It's a bit more difficult. So I don't want to exaggerate there. And even though I already took them to the right thickness, I am going to be refinishing them using a bit of scraper. So the actual bending of the ribs, that's something that I'm not going to be doing now. If not, that I will probably do it tonight. The reason for that is because it's hot, and it might not seem like a very big deal, but the bending iron gets to a temperature of over 200 degrees. So it's like having a radiator in the room, and considering I have plenty of other things to do, which probably will be part of another video, I decided to do the actual bending during the night. When it's a bit colder, I can have the windows open, and if it was just bending the upper blocks, the upper bows and the lower bows, which don't require so much strength, it's okay. It doesn't take too much time. I can do it during the day as well. But for the C blocks, you actually need to pull really hard as well, or push. Some people bend their ribs the other way. Yeah, it's a lot of energy, a lot of strength involved next to the bending iron. Let's do it tonight. I was just thinking how about I prank you all, and I actually make a 30-minute long video of myself just looking at the wood from different angles, but don't worry, I will not do that. Or will I? No, I think not. I need to save battery. It's 11:05 p.m. It's late, I'm tired, I feel like I really need a shower. However, this is a perfect weather to be doing this. Well, not even perfect because it's still hot, but it's not as hot. I have the windows open, the fan on, so at least I can work now bending the ribs. So I'm going to get my bucket of water, and instead of putting my head inside it, which is what I feel like I would like to do right now, I'm going to be dipping a part of the ribs in them and start bending them. To bend the ribs, as always, there are a lot of different techniques, ideas, etc, etc, etc. I don't really think there's one better than the other, if not the one that works properly for each maker. Typically, for bending the ribs, I tend to put them inside the water, just the parts that I'm going to be bending, like fully inside the water, and then just barely make them wet on both sides, a little bit on the rest of the parts. For the other bouts, I typically just water them a little bit, only as well the part where it's going to be fully bent, but some people put them really inside all the time, and it works for them, so that's good. I actually think that I'm a person who doesn't bend the ribs that much. I think for me that works quite well to avoid getting some of the waves that sometimes happen, in particular when bending ribs for cello. Maybe just my own imagination. Sometimes it happens with makers that we tend to, let's say, believe too much in what we believe. Like we think that we found a secret, or like a recipe, or like the reason why something happens is exactly because we do it that way. I don't want to say that, so I know, or I think, I was almost making that mistake. I think that works for me, so I typically don't bend them that much, and then I put a few clamps and try to hold it in position, so that it adopts the shape a little bit more without having to heat it up so much. That's just my interpretation of how to do this. So every time you saw me going off screen, what I was doing is this, getting some fan action. No, actually what I was doing was just checking how the rib was bent, if it fits in here, or what I had to remove, gosh, let's not remove anything, what I had to retouch the bending, so if I had to adjust something or not. So yeah, that's what I was doing. Now I see that here it is slightly open, so I can touch this area a little bit more, and maybe here as well, just a little bit. This is too bent, has to be less bent in this area and more bent in this area. Before I forget, I will rub some soap on the mold, that way then the glue doesn't glue the ribs to them. Actually, someone recently in the comments asked me if this was some regular soap only, and when I was answering to him I realized of the funny story about it, about this soap, because this soap came from the old workshop that I used to have when I was a student, that I used to share with some friends, and by the time I got into that workshop the soap was already there, and I was one of the last ones, the last one to leave that workshop. So by that point these friends of mine had already moved abroad, which means that I ended up taking the soap, and now I'm hoping that that soap was only used for filing making purposes and nothing else. Okay. I'm sure my neighbors love me. So I had to make a few adjustments, and I obviously didn't film that because it was like half an hour or an hour just going back and forward, doing a little bit here, a little bit there, trying again. So very, very repetitive and similar to what I did before. And now, as you can see, I also decided to put some clamps to keep it in place and dry. And like as I was saying before, I try not to bend them too much. Then I leave them clamped here, cold, dry, for a little bit, and they get the shape, let's say. The important thing is that I don't have any flat areas, if not that the rib is always round everywhere. This is something very hard to explain, so I'm sure no one is really following what I'm saying. Perhaps it's just the fact that it's over midnight. So yeah. It's important to have curves absolutely everywhere, and that way this can work. If there are any flat areas, it will never work. There will always be like a very clear mark on the ribs. There will be like a strange angle or something like that. Here, once again, it's curved everywhere. Maybe not the exact same shape of the mold, but putting the clamps and letting it rest here for a bit, it will adopt that shape. So now I'm going to be bending the other side and then I will glue. Okay, so now I'm ready to glue. I'm already warming the glue up, which I obviously prepared yesterday night because, as always, it has to be super fresh. So this means that I unfortunately need to switch off the fan, and this is particularly sad because I also had to close the windows. Every time that I'm gluing this, I tend to drop some clamps and they are extremely noisy when they fall, and I really don't want my neighbors to kill me. So while I wait for the glue to warm up, I thought I should actually clarify something I said before, just in case, because there's always some internet genius who's going to be saying like, oh, he's not precise enough. No. When I said that the C-bout rib, it might be bent in a way that it doesn't have the exact same shape as the C-bout mold, we're talking about this in violin making terms, which means that probably I can correct something that is less than half a millimeter or something like that, and not in every place. In some places it has to be bent perfectly. So it doesn't mean that if I need to bend the rib with the shape of a C-bout and then I bend it with the shape of the Mona Lisa and I put some clamps in it, it's suddenly going to take the right shape for the C-bout. It doesn't mean that. So with that clarification said, let's start gluing this one.